A man wins a war with an idea, then cannot get home for 10 years. Homer's Odyssey, retold slowly in clear English, nothing here runs away from you. Listen for the moments when he talks his way out. Let's begin. The war ended with a wooden horse. For 10 years the Greek army had camped outside the walls of Troy, and for 10 years the walls had held. Then one man had an idea. Build a horse of wood, tall as a house, hollow inside. Leave it standing on the empty beach. Sail the ships away, out of sight behind an island, and let the city believe the siege is finally over. The people of Troy came out at dawn and found the beach quiet and the horse standing there alone. They argued about it all morning. Then they pulled it through their own gates, because a gift is easier to believe than a trap. That night, the men inside the horse climbed down. The idea belonged to Odysseus, king of a small rocky island called Ithaca. He was not the strongest man in that army. He was the one who could outwit a stronger man and make it look like luck. When the fighting was over at last, the kings loaded their ships and turned for home, and some of them were sitting in their own halls within a month. Odysseus was not. It would be 10 more years before he stood in his own doorway, and the reason is the story you are about to hear. So what was happening at home while he was gone? On Ithaca there was a house on a hill, and in that house a woman named Penelope was waiting. She was his wife. When he sailed away, their son Telemachus was a baby in her arms. By now the boy was old enough to shave, old enough to sit in his father's chair and feel how badly it fitted him. And the house was full of visitors who would not leave. More than 100 young men from the islands nearby had moved in. They ate the family's food, drank the family's wine, and told Penelope the same thing every day. Your husband is dead, choose one of us, and all this waiting can stop. She could not throw them out. There were too many of them, and no man in the house to stand beside her. She could not say yes either, because she did not believe he was dead. So she did what her husband would have done. She used words. We're going to follow him home from that beach to that door, one place at a time. 10 years, and he does not fight his way through most of them. Here's the question I want you to hold on to. If he was clever enough to end a war, why did it take him 10 years to cross one sea? Penelope's answer was a piece of cloth. She told the men in her house that she would choose a husband as soon as she had finished weaving a burial cloth for her husband's old father. It would be shameful, she said, to marry before that work was done. Nobody could argue with that. So they waited. She wove all day where everyone could see her, and at night, alone, she quietly pulled the day's work out again. The cloth never grew. She bought herself 3 years with a promise that was true in every word and false in every way. That is the family we are dealing with. Now back to the sea. 12 ships left Troy under Odysseus. A storm took them south, past the last island anyone recognized, into water where the maps simply ran out. His men were tired and hungry, and certain that home was only a few days away. They were wrong by 10 years. The first place they came to had green hills, good water, and a cave near the shore with sheep outside it. Nobody answered when they called. There was food inside cheese stacked in baskets, milk standing in wide bowls, and the men wanted to take what they could carry and run. Odysseus said no. He wanted to meet whoever lived there. It was the worst decision of his life. The owner came home at sunset. He was a giant, one of a family of giants who kept sheep on that coast and answered to nobody. His name was Polyphemus, and he had one eye in the middle of his forehead. He drove his animals in, and then he lifted a stone across the mouth of the cave. A stone so large that 20 men could not have moved it. Then he turned round and came face to face with the strangers by his fire. He asked who they were. Odysseus answered politely, "We are soldiers going home from a war, and by the custom of your own country a host feeds his guests." The giant laughed at the custom. He reached out, took 2 of the men, and those 2 were never seen again. Nobody slept that night. Here is the trap, and it's worth understanding before we go on, because the whole story turns on it. Odysseus had a sword. He could have used it while the giant slept, but the stone across the door needed a giant's strength to move, and a dead giant moves nothing. Kill him, and every one of them starves in the dark behind it. So the sword was useless. Strength was useless. Whatever got them out of that cave was going to have to be something else. In the morning, the giant ate again, and watch how carefully Odysseus begins to outwit him. He did not beg. He did not threaten. He held his tongue all morning and watched. Then he waited until the sheep were out and the stone was back in place, and he opened the one thing he had carried up from the ship that the giant did not have. A skin of very strong wine, dark and sweet, the kind that is normally mixed with water before anyone drinks it. He offered it as a gift. The giant drank it as if it were milk and asked for more. Twice more. Then, warm and slow and pleased with himself, Polyphemus asked the stranger's name and promised him a present in return. Odysseus said, "My name is Nobody. My mother and my father call me Nobody. Everyone calls me Nobody." The giant thought that was funny. "Your present," he said, "is that I will eat nobody last." And then he fell asleep. Think about what has just happened. Odysseus is traveling under an assumed name, a name that is not his, and the giant has accepted it without a second's doubt, because a drunk man does not examine a word. That word is now lying on the floor of the cave like a loaded weapon, and nobody in that cave knows it except the man who put it there. They had cut a stake from the giant's own wood pile that morning, sharpened it, and hidden it under the straw. Now they put the point of it in the fire until it glowed, and 4 men lifted it, and they drove it into the giant's one eye. The cave filled with a scream that went out through the stone and along the whole coast. The other giants came running. They stood outside the blocked door in the dark and shouted in, "Who is hurting you? Who is attacking you?" And Polyphemus, in pain, told them the exact truth. "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody is attacking me." So they went home. "If nobody is hurting you," the neighbors said, "then this is a matter between you and the gods," and they walked back to their own caves and their own sheep and left him to it. That is the moment the whole story is built on. Odysseus did not talk his way out of that cave with a speech. He did it with one word, given the night before under an assumed name, in a mind too slow and too proud to check it. He had outwitted a creature 10 times his size, and the weapon was a name. But he was still inside. The stone was still there, and the man who had to move it was now blind and awake. In the morning, the blind giant rolled the stone back just far enough to let his sheep out to grass, and sat down in the gap with his hands spread wide, feeling the back of every animal that passed him. He felt backs. He never felt underneath. Odysseus tied the sheep together in 3s and put a man under the middle one of each 3, holding on in the deep wool. He took the last one himself, the big ram, and went out hanging under it with his face turned up into the warm belly of the animal that was carrying him. They reached the ship. They pushed off, and then Odysseus did the one thing in this whole story that cost him everything. He could not hold his tongue. He had entered that cave under an assumed name, and he could not leave it that way. He stood up in the moving ship and shouted back across the water. It was not Nobody. It was Odysseus of Ithaca. Remember the name. Why does that matter so much? Because a name is something you can pray with. The giant knelt on the shore and asked his father to keep that man off the sea, and his father was Poseidon, the god of the sea. The same sea this man still had to cross to get home. He had talked his way out of the cave. Then he handed over his own address. Let's stop at the mouth of that cave and take 4 expressions with us. 1, to outwit someone, to beat them by thinking faster, not by being stronger. Odysseus outwits a giant twice his size, and the weapon both times is a word. 2, to talk your way out of something, to escape a bad situation using only what you say. He talks his way out of that cave. He does not fight his way out. 3, under an assumed name, using a name that is not your real one. He travels under an assumed name for one night, and that one night saves 6 lives. 4. To hold your tongue to stay silent when speaking would cost you something. This is the one he fails. He cannot hold his tongue in the ship, and the price of those few seconds is 10 years of water. 4 expressions, 1 lesson. In this story, language is not decoration. It is equipment. The next island was not really an island. It floated, and a wall of bronze ran all the way round it, and inside lived a king whose one job was to look after the winds. He was kind to them. He fed them for a month, listened to the whole story of the war, and when they were ready to leave, he gave Odysseus a present. A leather bag tied shut with a bright silver cord. Inside the bag, he said, are all the winds that could push you off your course. I have left one outside, the west wind, and the west wind will carry you home. Do not open the bag. And if you are already thinking that somebody on that ship is going to let curiosity get the better of them, hold on to that. Odysseus took it and said nothing to his crew about what was in it. Think about that choice for a second, because he will pay for it. He is the man who wins by using words, and here, with the men he needs most, he uses none. He does not explain. He does not warn them. He simply ties the bag under his own seat and watches it. For 9 days, the west wind did exactly what the king had promised. Odysseus would not let anyone else hold the steering oar. He stood there through the days and through the nights, watching the water, saying little, until on the 10th morning, the men at the front of the ship started shouting and pointing. Ithaca, low and green on the edge of the sea, close enough to see the fires on the hills, where people were burning old wood on their own land. And Odysseus, who had not slept for 9 days, sat down at last and closed his eyes. So now picture the crew. They have rowed and starved for 10 years. Their king has been given a heavy bag by a rich man, and he has kept it under his hand and never once said what is in it. They are looking at gold. They are certain it is gold, and they are certain that he plans to carry it up to his own house while they go home with nothing. They let curiosity get the better of them. It is such a small thing, 1 cord, 1 knot, and their own coast is right there, close enough to smell. They opened the bag. Every wind in the world came out of it at once. The sea stood up. The little ships were picked up and thrown backwards along the road they had spent 9 days making. And when the noise finally stopped, they were tied up again at the bronze wall of the floating island, in front of the king who had helped them. Odysseus went up to the door and asked for help a second time. The king looked at him and refused. A man the gods are hunting, he said, is not a man I can shelter. Go away. And that is the end of the easy road home. From here on there is no gift, no shortcut, no kind stranger with a bag of winds. And here is what this chapter is actually about, because it is not the lesson you would expect. The men let curiosity get the better of them, yes, but they were only guessing because nobody had told them anything. Odysseus lost his home coast to a silence, his own. He is brilliant with words when he is talking to an enemy. With his own crew, he says nothing at all. That gap is going to open again. And next time, it will cost more than a coastline. 12 ships had left Troy. Storms and hard coasts had taken them one at a time, and by now only his own was still afloat. They came next to a wooded island with 1 thread of smoke rising out of the middle of it. Odysseus split the men into 2 groups and sent 1 group inland to find out who lived there. They found a stone house in a clearing, and around the house, lying in the grass, were wolves and mountain lions who got up as the men came near and pushed their heads under their hands like farm dogs. That should have been the warning. Those animals had been something else once. Inside, a woman was singing at a great loom. Her name was Circe. She opened the door, smiled, sat them down, and gave every one of them a warm bowl of cheese and barley and honey and wine. They ate it all. Then she touched them with a thin stick, and the men she had just fed were pigs shut in a pen behind the house, with their bodies changed and their minds left exactly as they were. That was the cruel part. They knew. One man had waited outside, watching through the trees. He ran the whole way back to the shore to tell Odysseus what he had seen. So Odysseus walked up to that house alone. On the path he came face to face with a young man, a stranger who knew far more than a stranger should, and who was not, in fact, a young man at all. Some help in this story arrives in a shape you would not question. He gave Odysseus a white flower with a black root, told him to eat it before he went in, and told him what to do when the stick came out. The flower held. Circe fed him, touched him with the stick, told him to go and join his friends in the pen, and he stood there in his own body and did not move. And that is the moment the whole chapter turns, so listen to what he does with it. He does not kill her. He has a sword, and she has just lost her only weapon. Instead, he sets a condition. Release my men and swear it. Swear that you will not use any of this against me again. He is going to drive a hard bargain with the one person on the island who can undo the damage, and the currency is not gold or force. It is a promise, said out loud, that she cannot take back. He had driven a hard bargain, and she took it. She gave her word. She swore the great oath he asked for, and then she went out to the pen and turned the pigs back into men taller. She noticed, and younger looking than before, which is a strange detail that the story keeps and does not explain. And then something happens that no summary of this story ever mentions. They stayed. Odysseus and his crew lived on that island for a year. There was food and rest and a roof, and nobody was hunting them. It was the men who ended it. They came to him and said, more or less, "Do you remember Ithaca? Are we going home, or are we living here now?" Circe did not go back on her word. She had sworn not to harm them, and she kept to it. She even told him what he would meet on the way, which is the only reason he survived the next 3 chapters. That is what the hard bargain bought him. But she also told him where he had to go first, and it was not home. Before Ithaca, she said, you have to sail to the edge of the world and speak to the dead. So they sailed to a gray shore where the sun never quite rises, and there Odysseus spoke with the dead. He went to ask one question, how do I get home? And he came back carrying 3 answers he had not asked for. 1. A blind old prophet told him the way was possible but narrow, and gave him a rule to follow later, at an island of cattle that were not his to touch. 2. His own mother came, and that was how he learned she had died of waiting. He tried 3 times to put his arms around her. 3 times there was nothing to hold. 3. The soldiers he had commanded at Troy came up out of the dark, and one of them, the greatest fighter of that whole war, told him plainly that he would rather be a poor man's servant alive than a king among the dead. Odysseus went to the edge of the world to ask about a route. What he brought back was the price of the 10 years. He turned the ship round and started for home, and now the sea had its own plans. 4 more expressions, and all 4 of them are about deals. 1. To let curiosity get the better of you, to be so curious that you do something you know you should not do. The crew let curiosity get the better of them, and it cost them their own coastline. 2. To drive a hard bargain, to negotiate firmly and get very good terms. Odysseus drives a hard bargain with Circe. He has a sword in his hand, and he still chooses to use a condition instead. 3. To give your word, to promise something seriously. She gives her word, and in this story that is heavier than a lock. 4. To go back on your word, to break a promise you have made. She does not go back on her word, and because she keeps it, he gets the information that saves him twice. Notice the pattern. In these chapters, the thing that actually decides who lives is not a weapon. It's a sentence, and whether the person who said it means it. Circe's warning came in order, like a set of instructions, and the first item on the list was the strangest thing in the whole story. You will pass an island, she said, and on it there are singers. Anything that comes within earshot turns towards the sound, and the water round that island is white with old bones. The song is not a trap because it is beautiful. It is a trap because of what it says. And here is the detail people forget. The singers do not promise love or gold or safety. They promise knowledge. Come closer, they sing, and we will tell you everything that happened at Troy, and everything that is still going to happen to you. That is aimed at Odysseus personally. He is the man who wants to know. He has walked into a giant's cave because he wanted to see who lived there. This is the same hook, made larger. So what does he do? He does not turn a deaf ear to it. That is the point I want you to hold on to. He decides to hear the thing that kills people, and to survive hearing it. His plan had two halves, and they were not the same for everybody. He took a great round of beeswax, cut it up, warmed it in his hands until it was soft, and pressed it into the ears of every man on board. They would turn a deaf ear to the island, because they would simply not be able to hear it. Then he told them to tie him standing to the mast, upright against the wood, with the rope round his chest and his arms. And this is the important half. He told them that if he begged to be untied, they were to ignore him and pull the ropes tighter. He took her warning to heart in the most literal way there is. He planned, in advance, for the version of himself that would want to die. Think about how strange that is. Every other danger in this story, he meets with a trick or a word. This one he meets by admitting that his cleverness will fail him. He cannot out-argue the song. So he removes his own hands from the decision before the decision arrives. The wind dropped as they came near, the way it does before something happens, and the men took the oars. The moment the ship was within earshot, the singing started, and it used his name. It called him by name, and it offered him the one thing he could not buy anywhere else. Everything that happened, and everything that will. He fought the ropes. He shouted at his crew, and his crew turned a deaf ear to him because there was wax in every ear on that ship. And two of them stood up and put more rope on him, exactly as he had told them to. Then the island was behind them, and the sound thinned out, and it was over. He is the only man in that story who is within earshot of that song and lives. Not because he was strong, because he took his own future weakness seriously and built for it. And I want you to keep that in your head for about 4 minutes, because the next thing Circe warned him about cannot be solved this way. It cannot be solved at all. It can only be chosen. The channel ahead of them was narrow, and it had a danger on each side. On the left, under a cliff, there was a cave, and in the cave lived a thing with 6 heads that reached down and took men off passing ships. On the right, close enough to see across, the sea went down into itself 3 times a day and swallowed everything on the surface: water, wood, whole ships. And the channel was too narrow to avoid both. Circe had been very clear about this, and her advice was the hardest sentence in the book. Do not fight the 6-headed thing, she said. Fight it at your peril. If you stop to fight it, you lose the ship and everyone on it. Steer close to the cliff and go past fast, and you will lose 6 men. 6 men chosen in advance, as the cost of the other 40 living. That is not a puzzle. There is no clever word that gets you out of it. This is the one chapter where the man who talks his way out of everything has nothing to say. So he did something here that he does nowhere else in the story, and I think it is the most human decision he makes. He told the crew about the whirlpool. He told them about the current and the cliff and how hard they would have to row. He did not tell them about the 6 heads. He had taken Circe's advice to heart, all of it except one line. She had told him to arm himself at his peril, and he put his armor on anyway and stood at the front of the ship with 2 spears, watching the cliff, waiting to fight something he had been told he could not fight. They went through fast. The whirlpool opened on their right, and they saw the bare floor of the sea at the bottom of it. And while every man on that ship was staring at the water on the right, the cave on the left reached down. The 6 were lost. He heard them and could do nothing, and the ship came out the other side. He had chosen the 6. That is what the word lesser costs when you use it about people. Past the channel there was an island with cattle on it, and the blind prophet's one rule came back. Whatever else you do, do not touch those animals. Odysseus wanted to sail straight past. The men were finished. They had rowed through a whirlpool and lost 6 friends in an afternoon, and they asked for one night on the beach. He made them swear not to touch the cattle, and they swore it, and then the wind turned against them and held them there for a month. The food ran out. And on the day, he walked inland to find fresh water and fell asleep. The men killed the cattle. They had given their word, and they went back on their word. And they broke it at the exact moment nobody was awake to argue with them. When they sailed, the sea took the ship apart. Every man who had eaten was gone. Odysseus went into the water holding a piece of the mast, and he came out 9 days later on a beach he did not know, alone, with nothing, at the very edge of the world. Ignore a warning like that at your peril. He kept his hands off those cattle, and he still lost everything, because he was not the only person on the ship. This pair of chapters is about listening, so the expressions are two. 1, to turn a deaf ear to something to deliberately not listen to it. The crew turn a deaf ear to the singers because their ears are full of wax. Odysseus does the opposite on purpose and survives it by being tied down. 2, within earshot close enough to hear. He is within earshot of the most dangerous sound in the world for about 10 minutes, and he is the only person who ever comes back from it. 3, to take something to heart, to accept advice or criticism seriously and act on it. He takes Circe's advice to heart, almost all of it. The one line he ignores is the one where he puts his armor on. 4, at your peril, a warning, meaning you will suffer if you do this. Ignore that prophet at your peril, and the crew did, and they did not sail again. 3 of those 4 are about what people do with a warning. That is not an accident. It is what the second half of this story is made of. The beach he washed up on belonged to Calypso, and he stayed there for 7 years. Understand what those 7 years were. It was not a prison with walls. It was a green island with fresh water and fruit on the trees, and caves that smelled of wood smoke, and a woman who wanted him to stay, and no boat. That is all. No boat, and no other person within 1,000 miles of open sea. She offered to make him deathless if he would stay. He said no. Every day he said no, and every day the answer changed nothing, because saying no to someone who is not holding a door open is just a sentence into the air. So he sat on the shore and looked at the water. That is what he did for 7 years, and the story says it in one line and moves on, and I think you will find it the loneliest line in the whole story. He longed to see the smoke going up from his own house. Not the house. The smoke, the proof that somebody was still cooking in it. What broke it was an argument he was not in. The goddess who had always favored him made his case in front of the other gods while the sea god was away, and she won it, and word was sent to the island. Let the man go. Calypso was angry, and she obeyed. She gave him tools, an axe with a good handle, an auger for boring holes, and showed him the tallest trees, and he built a raft himself over 4 days. 20 trees cut, trimmed, fitted, a deck, a mast, a sail she wove for him. He had been biding his time for 7 years, and the moment the door opened, he was working within the hour. She filled a bag with bread and dark wine and fresh water, and she told him the truth as he left. If you knew what was still coming, you would stay here. He went anyway. That is the answer to every offer in the story, deathlessness included. He would rather be a man who gets home than a man who cannot die. For 17 days the raft held. On the 18th, the sea god came back and saw him. The storm took the raft apart underneath him. He held a piece of it through 2 nights and 2 days, and on the 3rd day the water put him, salt burned and with nothing but a torn strip of cloth, on a strange beach, the last strange beach of the 10 years. He was found by the daughter of the king of that island, who was washing clothes at the river mouth with her friends. And now watch how he goes to work, because this is the whole story in miniature. He does not run at her. He does not say who he is. He comes out of the bushes holding a branch, and he speaks carefully, warmly, respectfully. And inside 2 minutes she has stopped being frightened and started arranging his welcome. That evening he sat in her father's hall, and they asked him for his story, and he told it. All of it. The cave, the name, the bag of winds, the singers, the 6 men. They listened, and when he finished, they gave him a ship. He talked his way home. Not fought. Talked. But the house he was sailing to had more than 100 men sitting in it, and not one of them was expecting him. They put him ashore on Ithaca while he was asleep, and sailed away, and left him on his own beach with the gifts stacked beside him. 20 years after he left it, he woke up on his own island and did not recognize it. The goddess met him there, in the shape of a young shepherd, and told him the situation in his own house. More than 100 men eating his food, his wife holding them off with excuses, his son gone to sea to look for news of him. And then she did the thing that decides the last 3 chapters. She changed him. She dried his skin into an old man's skin, thinned his hair, put a milky film over his eyes, and dressed him in a bag of rags. The most recognizable man in the country was now nobody in particular. And for once, this is not a trick he invented. It is exactly the tool he has used since the cave, handed to him by somebody else. For a while, be nobody. Tonight, he would pass for the poorest man in the country. He went first to the man who looked after his pigs. The swineherd lived in a hut at the far edge of the estate, and he fed the old beggar, and gave him the best bed he had, which was his own, and talked all evening about the master he was sure was dead. He said it kindly. He had no idea he was saying it to him. Odysseus kept a low profile for 2 days in that hut. He bided his time and asked ordinary questions. He listened to how the men in the house behaved, who they were, how many, how they were armed. You cannot outwit a room you have not counted. He was passing for a beggar so completely that a man who had known him for 30 years fed him twice and never looked twice. And then his son came back from sea and walked into that hut, and Odysseus had to make a decision he had not had to make since the giant's cave. Who gets told the truth, and when? He told Telemachus. Just Telemachus. Nobody else, not the swineherd, not his wife, not the old woman who had raised him. One person. That is his whole army. The next day he walked up to his own front door and sat down on the step of it, holding out his hand like any other beggar. What happens in that hall is hard to read, and it is meant to be. The young men, who had eaten his herds for years, threw things at him. One kicked him as he passed. They laughed at his rags and told him to try another house, and he took all of it and said nothing that mattered. 20 years earlier, a false name had saved him in a cave. Now he was sitting under an assumed name on his own doorstep. He was still passing for a beggar, keeping a low profile through every insult, and every insult was information. This one is cruel, this one is only following the others, this one would stop if anyone else did. Penelope heard there was a stranger in the house who had news of her husband, and sent for him. They sat opposite each other by the fire, and he told her a long, careful story in which he had met her husband once, years ago, and described the clothes he was wearing, clothes she had made herself. She cried. He watched her cry and kept his face completely still. He was 3 meters from the person he had crossed the world for, and he did not make himself known, and he held his tongue. Then Penelope did him a kindness that nearly ended everything. She called for the old woman who had nursed her husband as a baby, Eurycleia, and told her to wash the stranger's feet, the guest honor you give a man who has brought you news. Eurycleia knelt down with the basin, and halfway up his leg, under her thumb, she found a long white scar, the mark of a wild pig's tusk from a hunt when he was a boy, which she had cleaned and bound herself 30 years before. Her hands opened. The basin went over. The water ran across the floor, and she turned to look at his face and drew in the breath to say his name. He caught her wrist and pulled her close and told her quietly to hold her tongue. One sound out of that old woman, and it is over. And this is where you see how completely he has understood his own weapon by now. The man who lost 10 years by shouting his name across the water is now holding somebody else's mouth shut with his hand. He has not become stronger. He has become quieter. And in the morning, his wife is going to carry a bow down into that hall, which is either the luckiest thing that has ever happened to him or the end of him. 4 expressions for the quiet part of the story. 1. To long to do something, to want it deeply, over a long time. He longed to see the smoke going up from his own house. 7 years of longing, in one image. 2. To bide your time, to wait calmly for the right moment to act. He bides his time on that island, and again in the pig farmer's hut, and again on his own doorstep. 3. To keep a low profile, to avoid being noticed. He keeps a low profile in his own house for 2 whole days, while people who work for him walk past and see nothing. 4. To pass for someone, to be accepted as that person. He passes for a beggar in front of his wife, his nurse, and his oldest servant. And notice the 5th one, which is not new. He holds his tongue. He held it badly once in a ship 20 years ago, and it cost him everything. He holds it now with his hand over somebody else's mouth. Next morning, Penelope came down into the hall carrying a bow. It had hung in a storeroom for 20 years. It was her husband's, and it was famous, and nobody had touched it since he left. She put it down in front of the men who had been eating her food and said, "Here is how this ends." She was driving a hard bargain of her own, and every man in that room took it. "String this bow and send an arrow through the line of 12 axe heads standing in the floor, and I will marry you." Each axe head had a ring in the neck of it, and when they stood in a line, those 12 rings made one narrow tunnel of air. That is not a wedding announcement. That is a test, designed by somebody who knows exactly who can pass it. She had bided her time for 20 years, and she chose the one contest in the world with a single possible winner. So she put a hall full of confident young men to the test, and they lined up, and one after another they failed. They warmed the wood at the fire to make it bend. They rubbed it with fat. They pulled until their hands shook. Not one of them could rise to the occasion. Not one of them could bring the string to the notch. And the old beggar sitting by the door said, "May I try?" The hall laughed at him. Of course it did. The men said what men say. The wine has gone to his head, he thinks he's 20, give it to him and watch his arms come off. Telemachus said, quietly, "Let the guest have it." And the swineherd carried the bow the length of the room and put it in the hands of a man who was still passing for a beggar, and the old woman was sent to lock the doors at the far end. They let curiosity get the better of them, and the room went quiet because of how he was holding it. He had longed to hold that bow for 20 years, and he did not let his hands show it. He turned it over the way you turn over a tool you made yourself. He checked the wood for cracks. He found none. And then, sitting down, without standing up or making a show of it, he bent the bow and slipped the string into the notch as easily as a musician fitting a new string to an instrument. He plucked it once. It sang. Then he put an arrow on it, and from where he sat, he sent it through all 12 axe heads and into the wall beyond. He had risen to the occasion by not making an occasion of it at all. Then he stood up on the threshold with the bow in his hand and poured the rest of the arrows out onto the stone at his feet, and then said the sentence the whole story has been walking towards. He made himself known. The fight was short, and it was terrible. Telemachus and 2 loyal servants stood with him, and the doors were locked, and I am not going to describe it, because the story does not need it, and neither do you. When it was over, the men who had eaten 20 years of another man's food were gone. Here is the thing to notice, though, and it is easy to miss in the noise. He had put every one of those men to the test for 2 days, from a doorstep, in rags. He had sat among them for 2 days as a beggar, listening. One of them had spoken up for him. That one walks out of the hall alive. He had given his word to Telemachus that he would judge them by what he saw with his own eyes, and he did not go back on his word, on the worst day of his life. He had his hall back. He still did not have his wife. Upstairs, Penelope had slept through it. Eurycleia went up and shook her awake and told her that the beggar in the hall was her husband, and that the men were dead, and that it was over. And Penelope turned a deaf ear to her. 20 years of waiting had made her the most careful person in that house. Men had come to her door before with stories about her husband, sailors who had seen him, traders who had heard of him, every one of them wanting a meal and a bed for the news. Believe that kind of visitor at your peril. She had taken all of it to heart once, and it had all been nothing. So she came down the stairs and sat opposite him, across the fire, and looked at a man who had just risen to the occasion in front of a whole hall, and said nothing at all. Her own son was ashamed of her. "Mother," he said, "any other woman would be holding him. What is wrong with you?" And she said, in effect, "If he is my husband, we know things nobody else knows. There is no hurry." So she set her own test, and it is the best one in the book because it is invisible. She turned to the old nurse and said, quite calmly, but well within earshot of the man by the fire, "Move the bed out of our room and make it up for him out here." And the man by the fire came out of his chair. "Move it." "Who moved my bed?" "I built that room around an olive tree. I cut the trunk off at the height of a bed frame, and I built the bed on the living root. And there is no man alive who can move it unless he cut the root through first." That is all she needed. 3 sentences, and a fact that only 2 people in the world had ever known. You have just watched a test being passed by a man who did not know he was taking one. She came face to face with him then and put her arms round his neck. And for the first time in the entire story, he is the one who cannot speak. She did not ask him to prove anything. She said one false thing about a bed and let him correct it. So let's finish where we started with the name. 20 years earlier, in a cave, this man saved 6 lives by saying he was nobody. Then he stood up in a ship and shouted his own name across the water, and the sea took 10 years from him for it. He came home and hid it again. He was nobody in a beggar's rags on his own doorstep, nobody to his nurse, nobody to his wife, and he held that silence until the exact second it was worth spending. And at the very end, when he finally makes himself known, he does not do it with the bow. Anyone can shoot. He does it with a room and a tree and a private fact. That is what I wanted you to listen for. Not the monsters, the moments when he opens his mouth and something changes. He talks his way out of a cave he walked into by choice. He talks his way off a beach and onto a ship home. He talks his way into his own house. The strongest man at Troy is not the hero of this story. The one who knew when to speak is. The last 4 expressions, and they are the ones this ending is built from. 1, to put someone to the test, to set up a situation that shows what they can really do. Penelope puts a whole hall of men to the test with a bow, and then she puts her own husband to the test with a bed. 2, to rise to the occasion, to do well at the moment when it really counts. He rises to the occasion by sitting down and stringing a bow as if he were tuning an instrument. 3, to make yourself known, to reveal who you are. He makes himself known twice in this story. The first time it costs him 10 years. The second time he chooses the moment, and it gives him his house back. 4, to come face to face with someone, to meet them directly, often after a long time. He comes face to face with his wife across a fire, and neither of them says the obvious thing, and that is why we believe them. So that was Homer's Odyssey, retold slowly, from the wooden horse to the olive tree. A war ended by an idea. A giant beaten with a false name. A bag of winds opened by men who were never told what was in it. A bargain driven with a woman who could turn men into animals. A song heard by one man tied to a mast. A channel with a cost of 6 lives. 7 years on an island with no boat, and a raft built in 4 days. A beggar on his own doorstep, who kept a low profile long enough to count his enemies. A bow that only one pair of hands could string. And a bed built on a living tree. A bow that put a whole hall to the test, and one pair of hands that rose to the occasion. A man who came face to face with his wife across a fire, and would not make himself known until she had tested him too. The poem is very old. Most scholars think it grew out of a long spoken tradition, and the dates usually given for it run from the 8th century to the 6th century before the Common Era. Whether one poet called Homer shaped it, or many singers did, is still argued about, and many scholars would say it was both. We are not going to settle that here. Now, 2 questions before you go. 1. Where in this story does speaking cost him, and where does silence cost him? 2. At the end, why does he prove who he is with a fact about furniture instead of with the bow? Say your answers out loud, in full sentences. If you want to use this properly, do it in 3 passes. Listen once with the subtitles off, and let the story carry you. Play it again with the subtitles on and watch for the 20 expressions. They came back through the whole story on purpose, so that you would meet each one more than once. Then take one expression and say a true sentence about your own week with it. Out loud. That is the part most people skip, and it is the part that moves a phrase from something you recognize into something you own. This was a long one, and if you made it here, that is real listening practice, a long stretch of English without stopping. There is a whole shelf of shorter stories on the channel, from A2 up to C2, if you want something in one sitting next. And wherever you are listening from, thank you for staying to the end of it.